Sometimes the most powerful people in the world must become completely powerless to discover what true power actually means. The next morning, Daniel Whitmore did something that sent shockwaves through the business world, something that would be talked about in boardrooms and business schools for decades to come. He canceled the launch of Whitmore Industries' newest product line, a revolutionary technology platform that had taken 2 years and $200 million to develop, a launch that would have generated nearly $1 billion in revenue within the first quarter. Instead, he called a press conference that would destroy his reputation and possibly save his soul. The boardroom at Whitmore Industries had hosted many important announcements over the years. Mergers that reshaped entire industries, acquisitions that eliminated competitors, revolutionary technologies that changed how the world did business. The room itself was a monument to power and success, with a table that could seat 30 executives and windows that offered a commanding view of the Manhattan skyline. But it had never hosted anything like this. Daniel stood at the head of the table where billion-dollar decisions were made, facing cameras from every major news network. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his tie slightly askew, his hair mussed from running his hands through it during a sleepless night, his eyes red from tears he hadn't known he was capable of shedding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority. Instead, it trembled with the vulnerability of a man who had nothing left to lose because he'd already lost everything that mattered. "I called you here today not to talk about business, not to announce another acquisition or product launch, but to talk about the most catastrophic failure of my life." The reporters leaned forward like predators sensing weakness. Daniel Whitmore admitting failure was like witnessing a solar eclipse, rare, shocking, and impossible to look away from. 9 years ago, Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "With each word, I made a choice that has haunted every breath I've taken since. I walked away from a woman I loved and a child I never met because I was afraid that having a family would interfere with my ambitions. I chose success over love, wealth over presence, empire over everything that actually gives life meaning. Yesterday, I discovered that the little girl I've been walking past on street corners, the child I've ignored in my relentless pursuit of profit, is my daughter." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like lightning, and Daniel stood in the center of it all like a man in the eye of a hurricane, finally telling the truth that had been eating him alive for nearly 3 decades. "Her name is Lila Sarah Chen," Daniel said, raising his voice above the chaos. "She's 9 years old. Her mother, Sarah, died 6 months ago from cancer, and since then, my daughter has been living in shelters and on the streets. While I slept, in a penthouse worth $12 million, my child was selling worn shoes to buy food. While I accumulated wealth I could never spend in 10 lifetimes, my daughter learned to survive on scraps and the kindness of strangers." Daniel paused, his composure cracking completely. Tears fell down his face as millions of people watched, as the most private man in corporate America exposed his deepest wound to the world. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered into the microphone, his voice carrying to living rooms and offices around the globe. "I don't deserve a second chance. I don't deserve to call myself her father. But my daughter deserves everything I should have given her from the moment she took her first breath. She deserves a father who chooses her over everything else, who puts her needs above his own ambitions, who loves her unconditionally even though he has no right to expect that love in return. So I'm choosing her now," Daniel announced, his voice gaining strength from the act of finally speaking his truth. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Whitmore Industries. My controlling shares will be liquidated and placed in a trust for Lila to ensure she never wants for anything again. But more importantly than money, more crucial than financial security, I'm asking for help from anyone watching this." Daniel held up the photograph Sarah had left, mother and daughter in the hospital, both smiling at a future that should have included him. "My daughter is out there somewhere in this city, scared and alone. She doesn't trust me and she has every reason not to. She's learned that adults make promises they don't keep, that sudden interest usually means disappointment. But if anyone sees her, if anyone knows where she is, please help me bring her home. This is what she looked like as a baby, Daniel said, holding up the photograph with shaking hands. Now she's 9, with dark hair that falls in waves around her face and brown eyes that carry too much knowledge for someone so young. She's brilliant and brave, and has survived more in her short life than I have in 48 years of carefully managed existence. She deserves so much more than I ever gave her. His voice broke completely as he continued. Lila, if you're watching this, if someone shows you this video, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I'm a stranger who shares your DNA but has never earned the title of father. But I want you to know that walking away from you and your mother is the greatest regret of my life. Not finding you sooner, not being there when you needed me most, not choosing love over ambition. These are the failures that define me. If you give me a chance, just one chance, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserved from the beginning. I'll learn your favorite color and your favorite food. I'll help with homework and drive you to school and teach you to ride a bike if you want to learn. I'll read bedtime stories and check for monsters under the bed and love you so fiercely that you'll never doubt your worth again. Daniel set down the photograph and looked directly into the camera, speaking not to the millions of viewers but to one 9-year-old girl who might be watching, might be listening, might be ready to believe that sometimes adults actually mean what they say. I don't need Whitmore Industries. I don't need my wealth or my reputation or any of the things I thought made me important. I need my daughter, and I'll wait for her as long as it takes wherever she needs me to be, until she's ready to let me try to earn the love I should have been giving her all along. The press conference ended in chaos. Reporters shouted questions about stock prices and corporate succession and the business implications of Daniel's decision. But Daniel had already left the room, walking away from the empire he'd built to begin the most important search of his life. The video went viral within hours. Find Lila began trending worldwide as millions of people shared the story of a billionaire who'd given up everything to find his daughter. Coffee shops played the video on loop, customers wiping away tears as they watched a man destroy his reputation to save his relationship with a child he barely knew. Taxi drivers talked about it on their radios. Social media exploded with support, with people sharing the story and joining the search. Mothers held their own children a little tighter, and fathers called estranged children to say they were sorry. But it was an 8-year-old boy named Marcus, not Daniel's assistant but a resident of the same shelter where Lila sometimes stayed, who provided the crucial information. I seen her, he told Mrs. Rodriguez, who immediately called Daniel. She goes to the park sometimes, the one with the big fountain where people throw pennies and make wishes. She says it makes her feel close to her mama because her mama used to take her there when it was warm, before she got sick. Washington Square Park. Daniel had passed it thousands of times in his previous life, rushing from meeting to meeting, deal to deal, empire-building venture to empire-building venture. He'd never stopped to notice its beauty, its peace, the way it served as an oasis of green tranquility in the concrete jungle of Manhattan. Now, as evening approached and snow began to fall again like a benediction, Daniel sat on a bench near the fountain where people threw coins and believed in miracles. He'd been there for 3 hours, waiting with the patience of a man who'd finally learned that the most important things in life can't be rushed, can't be controlled, can't be acquired through force of will. He had no security team, no assistants, no one to manage his schedule or protect his carefully crafted image. Just a father, holding a pair of tiny shoes that had started this impossible journey, hoping against hope that love could overcome fear, that trust could be earned, that sometimes the universe offers second chances to those brave enough to ask for them. As the city lights began to twinkle and the snow continued to fall like blessings from heaven, Daniel Whitmore, former billionaire, former CEO, former master of the universe, was about to learn that the most important business of his life had nothing to do with business at all, and everything to do with the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over everything else. Some moments are so perfect in their imperfection that they rewrite the entire story of who we thought we were meant to be. The snow fell harder as the evening deepened, each flake catching the light from the park's vintage lampposts like tiny stars finding their way to Earth. Daniel had been sitting on the weathered bench for nearly 4 hours, His expensive coat soaked through, his hands numb with cold, his perfectly styled hair disheveled by wind and weather. He didn't care. He would have sat there for 4 days, 4 weeks, 4 years if necessary. Time had become irrelevant when measured against the possibility of redemption. Around him, the city continued its relentless dance of ambition and desire, but the park existed in a bubble of possibility where miracles could still happen and broken things could be made whole. At 9:47 p.m., Daniel would remember the exact time for the rest of his life. She appeared. Lila emerged from behind a cluster of snow-covered trees like a vision from a dream, like an answer to prayers Daniel hadn't known he was capable of praying. She moved slowly, carefully, her small frame bundled in a coat that was too big and boots that had seen too many winters. In her arms, she carried something precious, a teddy bear with one missing eye that had clearly been loved beyond its capacity to remain beautiful, the kind of toy that becomes family when family isn't enough. She stopped about 20 feet away, studying Daniel with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned that hope could be dangerous, that trusting adults, too, quickly could lead to disappointments that shattered already fragile hearts. "Are you really my daddy?" Her voice was so quiet that Daniel had to strain to hear it over the fountain, so tentative that it might have been the wind speaking instead of a child who'd spent 9 years wondering if she was worthy of being claimed by the man who'd helped create her. Daniel's heart shattered and reassembled itself in the space of those 5 words. He stood slowly, every movement careful and deliberate, not wanting to make any sudden gestures that might scare away this miracle that had walked out of the darkness into his life. "Yes," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of 29 years of absence and 9 years of regret. "I'm your daddy, and I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you." Lila tilted her head in that gesture he was beginning to recognize as purely hers, though it carried echoes of Sarah's thoughtful nature. "Mama said you were important, that you had important things to do that couldn't wait for us." "Your mama was wrong," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion he'd spent decades learning to suppress. "The only important thing I ever should have done was love you. From the very beginning, from the moment I knew you existed, I should have chosen you over everything else." They stood there in the falling snow, father and daughter, separated by 20 feet and 9 years of missed birthdays, bedtime stories that were never read, first steps that went unwitnessed, first words that fell on absent ears. All the moments that make a childhood beautiful, all the memories that form the foundation of a life, gone irretrievable, lost to the choices of a young man who'd thought success was more important than love. "I saw you on TV," Lila said, taking a tiny step forward. "You cried in front of all those people." "Yes, I did. Grown-ups aren't supposed to cry. That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says. She says crying is for babies." Daniel knelt down in the snow, bringing himself to her eye level, making himself smaller so she could feel bigger. "Grown-ups are supposed to cry when they've lost something precious. And you, Lila, you're the most precious thing I've ever lost. I should have been crying for you every day for 9 years." "I brought you something," Daniel said, pulling the tiny shoes from his coat pocket. They looked even smaller in his large hands, these symbols of all his failures and all his hopes, worn with age and love and the passage of tiny feet that should have known his protection. "Your mama bought these for you before you were born, when you were still growing inside her, when she was planning a future that included both of us. She wrote my name inside because she wanted you to know that even though I wasn't there, even though I was too scared and too selfish to stay, I was yours. I've always been yours." Lila stared at the shoes, her young mind processing the weight of what they represented. "She talked about you sometimes when she was really sick near the end. She said you were probably building big buildings and helping important people and changing the world." "I wasn't helping anyone," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking with the honesty he should have practiced years ago. "I was just running away from the most important people in my life. From you and your mama. I was building an empire of nothing while the two of you were living a life of everything that mattered. Another step closer." Lila was now close enough that Daniel could see the details that had been hidden by distance. The freckles scattered, across her nose like constellations, the impossibly long eyelashes that had been Sarah's pride, the small scar on her chin that spoke of adventures and mishaps that he'd missed, stories he'd never heard. "Are you going to run away again?" she asked. And Daniel understood that everything, his entire future, her capacity to trust, the possibility of healing for both of them, hinged on his answer to this question. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge made of hope and fear, fragile but crucial, laden with the possibility of connection or the confirmation of every abandonment fear this child had ever carried. "Never," he whispered. And the word carried the force of an oath, a vow, a promise sealed with everything he had left to give. "Never again. If you let me, if you give me a chance to prove that I can learn to be the father you deserve, I want to spend every day for the rest of my life showing you how sorry I am. I want to learn your favorite color and your favorite food and what makes you laugh. I want to help with homework and sing you to sleep and teach you how to drive when you're old enough. I want to be there for every scraped knee and every bad dream and every achievement and every disappointment. I want to be the daddy who shows up, who stays, who chooses you over everything else in the world. I want to give you the childhood you deserve, even if we have to start when you're 9 instead of when you were born." Lila took the final steps that separated them, crossing the invisible line between stranger and family, between fear and trust, between the life she'd known and the life that might be possible. Up close, Daniel could see that she had dimples when she almost smiled, that her eyes held flecks of gold that caught the lamplight, that she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength forged in circumstances no child should have to endure. She reached out with one small, cold hand and touched his cheek, her fingers gentle against skin that had forgotten what tender touch felt like. "You're really crying again," she observed with the matter-of-fact tone children use to make sense of the adult world. "Yes, I am. Are you sad?" Daniel considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an answer that was both honest and hopeful. "I'm sad about all the time we lost. I'm sad that I missed your first steps and your first words and every birthday you've had. But I'm not sad right now, in this moment. Right now, I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire life. Because you're here and you're mine and you're giving me a chance I never deserved." Lila smiled, the first real unguarded smile she'd allowed herself since her mother died. It transformed her entire face, revealing those dimples Daniel was learning to love, lighting up her eyes in a way that made her look exactly like Sarah when she was truly happy. "Can I?" She hesitated, gathering courage that shouldn't have been necessary but was the only way she knew how to protect her heart. "Can I hug you? Just to see what it feels like?" Daniel didn't trust his voice to answer. Instead, he opened his arms, the same arms that had closed themselves off from human connection for nearly 30 years, and waited. Lila stepped into his embrace like she was coming home after a long journey through dangerous territory, like she was finally safe enough to be small again. As Daniel held his daughter for the first time, feeling her small body fitting perfectly against his chest, he understood that every achievement in his life had been preparation for this moment. Every success had been meaningless without this connection. "I love you, Lila," he whispered into her hair that smelled like snow and hope and the particular sweetness of childhood that survives even the hardest circumstances. "I've loved you every day of your life, even when I was too scared and too stupid to admit it, even when I was running from that love like it was something dangerous instead of something sacred. I love you too, Daddy," she whispered back. And Daniel understood that he was being given a gift he'd never deserved but would spend his lifetime earning, would spend every remaining breath proving worthy of. They walked out of the park together, hand in hand, Lila's small fingers intertwined with Daniel's as if they'd been practicing this simple gesture of connection their entire lives. Daniel called his driver, not to take them to his penthouse, but to begin the journey of finding a real home they would choose together, a place where love lived in every corner, and family meant more than blood relation. The next morning, Daniel would sign papers transferring ownership of Whitmore Industries to his board of directors. He would liquidate his assets and establish the Lila Hope Foundation, dedicated to helping abandoned children find their families, and families learn to choose love over everything else. But more importantly, Infinitely more importantly, he would learn to braid hair and pack school lunches. He would attend parent-teacher conferences and dance recitals and school plays where Lila forgot her lines but remembered that her daddy was in the audience, cheering for her. He would read bedtime stories and check for monsters under the bed, and learn that the scariest monsters are the ones we carry inside ourselves, the ones made of regret and missed opportunities and love unexpressed. 6 months later, Daniel and Lila could be found every Saturday morning in Washington Square Park, the place where their real story began, distributing shoes to homeless children. Daniel would kneel down to each child's level, fitting the shoes carefully while Lila held their hands and told them stories about how the right shoes could carry you to better places if you just kept walking, just kept believing, just kept looking for the love that was searching for you too. The teddy bear with one missing eye, whose name, Daniel learned, was Mr. Patches, sits on a shelf in Lila's bedroom in the house they chose together, watching over a little girl who finally has a safe place to sleep, and a father who tucks her in every night with stories and songs and promises he has every intention of keeping. And sometimes, when Daniel looks at his daughter, really looks at her while she's drawing or reading or simply existing in the space they've created together, he sees Sarah's smile and knows that forgiveness isn't something you earn through grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's something you receive when you finally stop running from love and start running toward it, when you choose presence over presence, when you understand that the greatest success is measured not in dollars or achievements, but in the trust of a child who calls you daddy and means it. The worn white shoes sit in a place of honor on their mantelpiece, no longer symbols of abandonment and regret, but reminders that every ending can become a beginning if you have the courage to change the story, to choose differently, to believe that love is always worth the risk of being broken by it. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, through every moment of pain and every glimpse of hope, you understand something that our world often forgets. It's never too late to choose love. It's never too late to come home to the people who need you most. It's never too late to rewrite the story of who you thought you had to be. Maybe you're watching this because you see yourself in Lila, the abandoned child still waiting in the snow for someone to choose you, to claim you, to love you enough, to stay. Maybe you see yourself in Daniel, the person who's achieved everything the world says matters while missing everything your heart knows is important. Or maybe you see yourself in Sarah, loving someone who couldn't stay, hoping they'll find their way back to what matters most. Wherever you see yourself in this story, know this truth. You are worthy of love that stays. You are worthy of being chosen, not just once, but every day. You are worthy of second chances and new beginnings and arms that hold you tight enough to make up for all the times no one was there when you needed them most. Your story isn't over. Your heart isn't too broken to heal. Your past doesn't define your future unless you choose to let it. And somewhere in this vast, beautiful, broken world, love is looking for you just as desperately as you're looking for it. If this story has touched the deepest chambers of your heart, if it's reminded you that love is always worth fighting for, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with the person who feels invisible, the one who's been abandoned, the one who's given up on being chosen. Because healing happens in community, and sometimes the person sitting next to us is fighting the same battles, carrying the same wounds, hoping for the same miracle. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of broken people becoming whole, of lost children finding their way home, of love that heals even the deepest wounds. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might be exactly what your heart needs to hear. But most importantly, remember this. In a world that often leaves people behind, you can be the one who stays. You can be the one who chooses love over convenience, presence over profit, connection over control. You can be the one who proves that it's never too late to become the person someone else needs you to be. The universe is always offering us chances to love better, to choose differently, to write new endings to old stories of pain and abandonment. Don't let those chances walk away. Don't let fear convince you that you're unworthy of the love you've been seeking your entire life. Your Lila is out there. Your Daniel is waiting in the snow. Your chance to choose love over everything else is coming. Might be here right now. might be disguised as an interruption to your perfectly planned life. Thank you for joining us in this sacred space where stories become healing, where pain transforms into wisdom, where the abandoned learn they were never forgotten, only temporarily lost. Until next time, remember, you are loved beyond measure, you are chosen beyond doubt, and your story, your beautiful, broken, healing story, matters more than you know. What would you do if the person you loved most in this world kept a secret so devastating that it would shatter everything you believed about your life together? A secret so profound that it would force you to question not just their love, but the very foundation of who you thought you were. Tonight I want to tell you about Lucas Granger, a man who thought he knew what love meant, a man who believed he understood the woman who shared his bed, his dreams, his future, his deepest fears, a man who thought he had mapped every corner of his wife's heart, only to discover entire continents he'd never known existed. This isn't just a story about secrets. It's about the moment when we discover that the people we love aren't the perfect beings we've created in our minds, and somehow, miraculously, that makes our love for them even more real, more necessary, more transformative. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on to what we thought we knew. It's choosing to love what we never expected to find. It's learning that broken doesn't mean worthless, that secrets don't always mean deception, and that family can be born in the most unexpected moments. You see, love isn't a museum where we preserve perfect moments behind glass. Love is a living thing that grows in the cracks between our expectations and reality. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to let it, love teaches us that our greatest heartbreaks can become doorways to our greatest joys. 3 years ago, Lucas Granger lost his wife Emily in a car accident that took more than just her life. It took his faith in tomorrow, his belief in purpose, his ability to imagine a future that held anything but endless, echoing emptiness. But what he found in a Montana snowstorm would prove that sometimes love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it just begins again in ways we never imagined possible. Sometimes the universe has a way of giving us exactly what we need, wrapped in packaging we don't recognize, delivered at moments when we think we've given up on hope entirely. Picture this: a sprawling wooden mansion nestled in the Montana wilderness like a sleeping giant. 6,000 square feet of hand-hewn timber and floor-to-ceiling windows that once framed laughter, dinner parties, Sunday morning coffee in bed. Now those same windows reflect only emptiness, vast, pristine, suffocating emptiness. This is where Lucas Granger exists. Not lives. That word implies movement, growth, purpose. Exists, like a ghost haunting his own life. At 40 years old, Lucas had everything the world told him he should want. Chief Executive Officer of Granger Financial Technologies, one of the fastest-growing fintech corporations in America. His company's algorithms powered investment platforms used by millions. Forbes had called him the man of the year who's revolutionizing retirement. His personal net worth? North of $200 million and climbing. But money, Lucas had learned, can't warm a bed that's been cold for 3 years. Success can't fill the Emily-shaped hole that grows larger, not smaller, with each passing day. Every evening, Lucas would walk through rooms that echoed with memories so vivid they felt like living things. The gourmet kitchen where Emily used to hum Dave Matthews Band songs while making her terrible coffee. She always made it too weak, but he'd never had the heart to tell her. The reading nook by the great room fireplace where she'd curl up with her psychology journals and mystery novels, unconsciously twirling a strand of her auburn hair between her fingers when she was thinking. The master bedroom where he still slept on only his side of their king-sized bed, as if keeping her space warm might somehow call her back. He'd tried everything grief counselors recommend. Therapy with Dr. Patricia Yates, who specialized in complicated grief. What a phrase, as if there were any other kind. Traveling to places Emily had never been, hoping to make new memories that wouldn't be haunted by her absence. Throwing himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. Lucas's days had become a carefully choreographed dance around the places where Emily used to be. He'd moved his home office to the guest bedroom because he couldn't bear sitting at the desk where she used to grade her patients' assessments. He'd hired a housekeeper to clean the rooms he couldn't bring himself to enter. He ordered groceries online because walking through the aisles at Whole Foods, where Emily had known every employee's name and always bought flowers for their kitchen table, felt like drowning in broad daylight. The worst part wasn't the big moments, weddings, holidays, anniversaries. Those he could brace himself for, could see coming and build walls accordingly. The worst part was the ambush of small things. Finding her bookmark still marking page 247 of The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo on her nightstand. Discovering a grocery list in her handwriting stuck to the refrigerator. Milk, those crackers Lucas likes, flowers, yellow ones. The automatic renewal of her Netflix subscription showing up on his credit card statement. But perhaps the cruelest ambush of all was hope. The way his heart would leap when he heard a car door slam in the driveway, forgetting for just a moment that she wouldn't be walking through their front door anymore. The way he'd reach for his phone to text her funny things he saw during the day, his thumb hovering over her contact, before reality crashed back in. Some nights, when the silence became so complete it felt like a presence in the house, Lucas would retrieve their wedding album from the bottom drawer of Emily's nightstand. The leather cover was worn smooth from his desperate fingers, the edges soft as cloth from 3 years of this ritual. Page after page of a woman the world had adored. Dr. Emily Charlotte Morrison Granger, child psychologist at Billings Children's Hospital. Volunteer coordinator for 3 different charities. The woman who could light up a room just by walking into it, who made everyone feel like they were the most interesting person at the party, who had a laugh that was simultaneously musical and completely unself-conscious. In their wedding photos, Emily was radiant in a way that went beyond the professional makeup and perfect lighting. She glowed with the kind of happiness that comes from absolute certainty, the bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment in her life. But you know what haunted Lucas most as he turned those pages? It wasn't just her absence, devastating as that was. It was a question Emily had asked him 6 months before the accident. A question that had seemed so random at the time that he'd barely given it thought. They'd been lying in bed on a Sunday morning, her head on his chest, sunlight streaming through their bedroom windows when she'd whispered, "If one day I'm no longer here, will you still love me like before?" He'd laughed it off, the way you laugh off morbid thoughts when you're 37, and healthy and planning to grow old together. "Why would you ask something like that?" he'd said, kissing her forehead. "You're not going anywhere. We've got at least 50 more years of you stealing my socks and making terrible coffee." She'd smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. "Just promise me. Promise you'll still love me even if you learn things about me that you didn't know before." You're being weird. Of course I'll always love you. There's nothing you could tell me that would change that." If only he had pressed her. If only he had asked what she meant, what secrets she thought she was carrying, what truths she was afraid would change his love for her. If only he had known that promises made in ignorance are so much easier to make than promises tested by reality. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Emily had been driving home from her mother's house in Billings, where she'd gone to help plan her cousin's wedding. Lucas had stayed home with a mild case of food poisoning. Ironic, considering he'd gotten sick from the fancy restaurant where he'd planned to take Emily for their Valentine's dinner. She'd called him at 6:47 p.m. He knew the exact time because he'd looked at his phone screen when it rang, had seen her smiling face looking back at him from their contact photo. "Hey, handsome, I'm about an hour out. Want me to stop and get soup for your tragic stomach?" "Just come home," he'd said. "I miss you. I love you too. See you soon." Those were the last words they ever spoke to each other. The Montana Highway. Patrol officer who came to his door 3 hours later was kind but thorough. Black ice on Highway 2. Emily's car had slid into oncoming traffic. The other driver, a young father of 2, had survived with minor injuries. Emily had not. She wouldn't have suffered, the officer assured him. It was instantaneous. Lucas had nodded and thanked him and closed the door, then spent the next 6 hours sitting on their kitchen floor, staring at the Valentine's Day card. He'd bought her, which was still sitting on the counter where he'd left it that morning. But grief, Lucas was learning, has a strange way of preparing us for moments we never see coming. It strips away everything we think we know about ourselves, leaving only the raw core of who we are when everything else is gone. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it creates space for love to return in forms we never imagined. On one particularly brutal Montana night, 3 years after he'd lost everything, Lucas would discover that love, real love, sometimes wears the face of 2 little girls who needed a hero just as much as he needed a reason to be one. Before we continue, I want you to think about someone you've lost, someone whose absence still echoes in your daily life, who left questions you'll never get to ask and conversations you'll never get to finish. Hold that feeling close, because Lucas's journey might just change how you see your own story of loss and love. February 14th. 3 years to the day since Emily's accident. The irony wasn't lost on Lucas. Valentine's Day, and here he was on a corporate jet to Denver, discussing quarterly profit margins and market expansion strategies with board members. Who thought grief should have an expiration date? You know, Lucas, Richard Hartwell had said during the flight, Emily wouldn't want you living like a monk forever. Maybe it's time to start thinking about getting back out there. Getting back out there. As if love were a recreational activity Lucas had temporarily lost interest in, like skiing or playing tennis. As if 3 years were enough time to get over losing the only woman he'd ever truly loved. The Denver meeting had been exactly what Lucas expected. 2 hours of PowerPoint presentations and strategic planning for a company expansion he didn't care about, generating profits for shareholders, whose names he barely remembered. His assistant had scheduled it for Valentine's Day deliberately, thinking work might distract him from the anniversary. Instead, it had only emphasized how meaningless everything felt without Emily there to share his successes and failures. Flight back to Bozeman was delayed 4 hours due to weather. February in Montana. Lucas should have known better. By the time he finally collected his rental car from the airport parking garage, the snowstorm had evolved into something biblical. The kind of weather that made meteorologists use words like unprecedented and life-threatening. Visibility, maybe 50 feet on a good stretch. Wind gusts strong enough to rock his Range Rover like a toy. The sensible thing would have been to stay in a hotel, wait until morning, let the plows do their work. But grief makes you reckless, and Lucas needed to be home. Needed to be in the place where Emily's presence still lingered in every corner, where her coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher because he couldn't bring himself to put it away. Mile after endless mile of Montana highway that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Nothing but snow and darkness and the hypnotic rhythm of windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against nature's fury. Lucas drove with the kind of focused concentration that comes from absolute necessity. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and he'd become another highway statistic. His phone had lost signal 20 miles outside of Bozeman. The GPS had given up trying to recalculate his route. He was navigating by instinct, and the occasional glimpse of road markers when the wind decided to show mercy. It was on one of these brief moments of clarity that he saw them. At first, Lucas thought his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him. 2 small shapes huddled at what looked like an abandoned bus stop, barely visible through the curtain of snow. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield that was already starting to ice over again. Children, 2 little girls, maybe 6 years old, pressed together for warmth like baby birds fallen from their nest. No adult in sight. No car. No shelter except a broken plexiglass bus stop that offered about as much protection as tissue paper against this storm. Lucas's first instinct was practical, logical, responsible. Call 911. Except his phone had no signal. Drive to the nearest gas station and report it. Except the nearest anything was at least 15 miles away, and these children would be dead from exposure long before help arrived. His second instinct was self-preservation. He had his own problems, his own pain to manage. These children weren't his responsibility. Someone else would come along, someone better equipped to handle a crisis involving kids. He drove past them, but something made him look in the rearview mirror. Maybe it was the way they were holding each other, the older one wrapping her thin arms around the smaller one like she could shield her from the entire world through sheer force of will. Maybe it was the memory of Emily reading to children at the hospital, her face glowing with the kind of joy he'd never been able to give her. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the recognition that some things matter more than your own comfort, more than your carefully constructed walls of grief and isolation. Maybe it was the understanding that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Lucas pulled a U-turn that would change 3 lives forever. The girls looked up as he approached, and Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. Not just because they were clearly half frozen and in immediate danger, their lips tinged blue and their small bodies shaking violently, but because, God in heaven, they looked familiar. The older one had auburn hair escaping from a hand-knitted cap the same rich, warm shade as Emily's, the color of autumn leaves caught in sunlight. Her eyes were wide and intelligent, watching Lucas with a wariness that spoke of too much experience with adults who made promises they didn't keep. But beneath the wariness was something else, a fierce protectiveness as she held the younger girl closer like a mother bird shielding her chick from a predator. The little one was different. A jagged scar ran from her left wrist to her elbow, angry and pink against her pale skin. She was talking to herself in a soft musical language that wasn't quite words, a flowing gibberish that should have seemed strange but somehow felt familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. "Hey there," Lucas said, crouching, down to their level so he wouldn't tower over them. "I'm Lucas, what are your names?" The older girl studied him for a long moment, her gaze direct and assessing in a way that was unnerving in someone so young. She was making calculations, weighing risks, deciding whether this stranger could be trusted with their lives. Finally, she spoke. "I'm Lila. This is Daisy." Her voice was clear and measured, carrying an authority that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "We're not supposed to talk to strangers." "That's a good rule," Lucas agreed. "But I think this might be one of those times when breaking rules is the smart thing to do. You two are going to freeze to death out here." Lila's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "We're waiting for someone." "Who are you waiting for?" For the first time, the older girl's composure cracked slightly. Someone's supposed to come." It was Daisy who made the decision for them. She looked up at Lucas with eyes that were far too knowing for a 6-year-old, eyes that had seen things no child should see, and said in a voice barely audible over the wind, "Are you going to hurt us?" The question hit Lucas like a physical blow. What kind of life had these children lived that this was their first concern about a potential rescuer? "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in 3 years. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help you get warm and safe." Daisy studied his face with the serious concentration children reserve for very important decisions. Then she reached out and took his hand with complete trust, her small fingers ice cold against his palm. "Okay," she said simply. As they drove toward his house, Lucas caught glimpses of the girls in his rearview mirror. Daisy had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhaustion and warmth overwhelming her small body. But Lila stayed awake, watching the landscape pass by with an expression Lucas recognized but couldn't place. It was the same way Emily used to look out windows during long drives, like she was memorizing everything, storing it away for some future moment when she might need to remember exactly how the light fell across the snow, exactly what sanctuary looked like. Lucas's house transformed that night in ways he couldn't have imagined. For 3 years it had been a mausoleum of memories, every room preserved exactly as Emily had left it. Suddenly it was filled with the chaos of childhood, wet clothes steaming by the fire, the rich smell of hot chocolate with marshmallows, the soft murmur of Lila reading to Daisy from one of Emily's old books. The girls had said almost nothing during their first hour in the house. They'd sat close together on the couch, accepting the warm clothes Lucas found in his storage closet, remnants from when his nieces visited, drinking hot chocolate in careful sips, watching him with the quiet alertness of small animals ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. It was only when Lucas had shown them to the guest bedroom, hastily made up with fresh sheets and extra blankets, that Lila had finally spoken. "How long can we stay?" The question was asked with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to hope for too much. Lucas found himself looking into eyes that held far too much wisdom for someone so young. "As long as you need to," he heard himself saying, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in 3 years. Of course, Lucas called the police, filed a missing persons report, provided descriptions, took photographs, did everything a responsible citizen should do when finding abandoned children in a snowstorm. The response was exactly what he'd expected and everything he'd hoped to avoid. Sometimes kids just slip through the cracks, Officer Janet Martinez had explained with the tired sympathy of someone who'd seen too much. Foster care, group homes, family members who can't handle the responsibility or decide kids are too much trouble. Could be days before anyone realizes they're gone. Could be weeks before anyone cares enough to report it. Days. These children could have frozen to death in that bus stop. And it might have been days before anyone noticed their absence. That first week passed in a strange suspension of reality. Lucas worked from home, making phone calls about finding the girls' families, arranging for temporary emergency custody through social services, consulting with family attorneys about his legal obligations. Official, responsible, detached. But every morning, he found himself making hot chocolate for 3 instead of coffee for 1. Every afternoon he discovered picture books scattered across his coffee table, books that had belonged to Emily, books she'd bought for the children she'd hoped they'd have someday. And every evening, he heard Lila telling Daisy stories in their shared bedroom, stories about brave princesses who saved themselves, dragons who turned out to be misunderstood, and homes where people stayed no matter what. The girls asked for almost nothing. They ate whatever he put in front of them, wore whatever clothes he provided, never complained about sleeping in a strange room or being cared for by a stranger. But Lucas began to notice small things. The way Lila always made sure Daisy ate first. The way Daisy would slip her hand into his when they walked through the house as if anchoring herself to this temporary safety. The way both girls would go completely still whenever they heard a car in the driveway, as if expecting someone to come and take away this brief respite from whatever hell they'd escaped. It was on the 4th day that Lucas finally admitted what he'd been trying not to see. He was sitting in his home office, ostensibly working on quarterly reports but actually watching Lila and Daisy play in the snow outside his window, when the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. The way Lila tilted her head when she was thinking, exactly like Emily used to do when she was working through a difficult case at the hospital. The way Daisy hummed while she played, the same unconscious melody Emily used to hum while cooking. The auburn highlights in both girls' hair that caught the sunlight in precisely the same way Emily's had. But it was more than physical resemblance. It was something deeper, more essential. The way Lila approached problems with careful logic, testing possibilities before committing to action. The way Daisy seemed to find joy in the smallest things, a snowflake on her mitten, the pattern frost made on the windows, the way hot chocolate steamed in her mug. They felt like Emily. Not just looked like her, but carried something of her essence in the way they moved through the world. It was Lila who made him hire the private investigator. Not because she asked him to. Lila was far too careful to ask for anything that might be denied. But because of what she didn't ask. Most children in her situation would have demanded to know when they were going home, when someone was coming. For them, whether Lucas was keeping them forever. Whether they were in trouble for being found. Lila asked none of these questions. It was as if she already knew the answers would disappoint her, as if she'd learned not to expect rescue from the adults in her life. So Lucas decided to find some answers that wouldn't disappoint. Answers that might explain why 2 little girls felt so much like missing pieces of his own broken heart. If this story is touching something deep in your heart, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like this take time to craft with care, and your support helps me continue bringing you content that speaks to the parts of our lives we don't often talk about, the messy, beautiful, complicated parts that make us human. Marcus Webb had been a private investigator for 23 years, long enough to know that the cases that seemed simple never were, and the cases that seemed impossible often had solutions hiding in plain sight. Missing persons, insurance fraud, cheating spouses, corporate espionage. He'd seen it all, documented it all, learned not to be surprised by the depths of human deception or the heights of human resilience. But when Lucas Granger walked into his downtown Billings office with photographs of 2 little girls and a story about finding them in a snowstorm, Marcus felt that familiar itch between his shoulder blades that meant this case was going to be different. Most people would have just called social services and walked away, Marcus observed, studying the photos Lucas had taken of Lila and Daisy. Professional shots, clearly taken with care, the girls playing in the snow, Lila reading to Daisy by the fireplace, both of them sleeping peacefully in the guest bedroom. What made you want to dig deeper? Lucas had struggled to put it into words. They feel familiar, like I'm supposed to know them, like they're supposed to be part of my life. Marcus had seen that look before, the expression of someone who'd found something they didn't know they'd been looking for. Familiar how? They remind me of my wife, Emily. She died 3 years ago. Physical resemblance? More than that. Lucas had paused, searching for language to describe something that felt more like recognition than resemblance. It's like, have you ever walked into a room and known you'd been there before even though you were certain you hadn't? It's that feeling, like these children are connected to Emily somehow. It took Marcus 3 weeks to trace the paper trail, and even then he had to call in favors from contacts in 3 different states. Foster care records sealed by court order, birth certificates with redacted information, medical files scattered across multiple jurisdictions, bureaucracy wrapped in red tape wrapped in more bureaucracy, all designed to protect children's privacy and, more often than not, to hide the system's failures. But Marcus was good at unraveling knots, especially knots that people had tried very hard to tie. And this particular knot led him through a labyrinth of group homes, emergency placements, and temporary guardianships that painted a picture of 2 little girls who'd been bounced around the system like pinballs. The breakthrough came when Marcus traced a medical record from Daisy's scar surgery. The attending physician had noted the name of the biological mother in his personal files that weren't supposed to exist, but that he'd kept because, in his words, someone should remember these children's real names. Emily Charlotte Morrison. Marcus had stared at that name for a full 5 minutes before picking up his phone to call Lucas. "You need to sit down for this," Marcus said when Lucas answered. "And you need to sit down somewhere private, somewhere you can process what I'm about to tell you." Lucas spread the documents across his kitchen table with hands that weren't quite steady. Birth certificates, medical records. DNA analysis reports that Marcus had somehow managed to obtain through channels he refused to explain. Court documents. Foster care placements. A paper trail that told the story of 2 little girls who'd been lost in the system for most of their short lives. Lila Marie Morrison, born March 15th, 7 years ago. Daisy Rose Morrison, born March 15th, 7 years. Chicago mother, Emily Charlotte Morrison. Father, unknown. The world tilted sideways. Lucas read the words again, certain he was misunderstanding something fundamental. But there it was in black and white, stamped with official seals and signed by a judge who'd probably never imagined the earthquake these documents would create in one man's life. Emily's signature on birth certificates dated 8 months before their wedding. 8 months before she'd walked down the aisle wearing white, promising to love and honor and cherish him. 8 months before she'd spoken vows about sharing everything, about having no secrets from each other, about building a life together based on complete honesty and trust. Lucas felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking exactly, but shifting. Like the foundation of a house settling in ways it was never meant to settle. like the tectonic plates of his understanding of his own life sliding past each other, creating new geography he didn't know how to navigate. Emily had had children. Twins. And in all their years together, through every conversation about wanting kids, through every discussion about their future family, through every moment when she'd held his hand and talked about the babies they'd have someday, she had never mentioned them, not once. She'd talked about wanting to be a mother as if it were a distant dream, something they'd worked toward together. She'd researched fertility specialists when they'd been trying for a year with no success. She'd cried in his arms when her period came month after month, as if each negative pregnancy test were a fresh heartbreak, all while knowing she'd already been a mother. All while knowing her children were somewhere out there, lost in a system that treated kids like inventory. Martha Morrison lived in a small house on the outskirts of Billings, surrounded by the kind of garden Emily used to dream about. Roses, and wildflowers and vegetable plots that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Lucas had called ahead, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when Emily's mother opened the door and saw his face. She was older than he remembered, grayer with new lines around her eyes that spoke of years of carrying secrets. But when she saw him standing on her porch, holding a manila folder full of documents that would change everything, her expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like relief. "Oh," she breathed, stepping back and pressing one hand to her chest. "Oh, Lucas, I was wondering when you'd come. I've been wondering for 3 years when someone would finally ask the right questions." They sat in a living room filled with photographs of Emily at every age, gap-toothed 7-year-old holding a fishing pole, prom queen teenager in a dress the color of midnight, radiant bride laughing as Lucas tried to feed her wedding cake. But nowhere, Lucas noticed with growing certainty, were there any pictures of grandchildren. "You know why I'm here," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. Martha nodded, her eyes filling with tears she'd probably been holding back for years. "The girls. You found them. After all this time, you found Lila and Daisy." Why didn't she tell me? The story Martha told was one of fear, desperation, and impossible choices made by a young woman who'd believed she had no good options. Emily, pregnant at 24 by a man whose name Martha still wouldn't speak aloud. A man who'd seemed charming and successful at first, but who'd revealed his true nature slowly, like poison seeping through cracks. "Jake," Martha finally whispered, and the name seemed to hurt her throat. Jacob Reeves. Emily met him at a conference in Seattle. He was older, established, seemed like everything she'd been looking for. Successful lawyer, drove nice cars, took her to expensive restaurants. But success and money, Martha explained, didn't make someone safe. Jake had been controlling from the beginning, but Emily hadn't recognized the warning signs until it was too late. He'd isolated her from friends, criticized her work, made her doubt her own perceptions of reality. When she got pregnant, he was ecstatic, said it proved she belonged to him now. That's the word he used. Belonged. Like she was property he'd acquired. Emily had tried to leave when the twins were born, but Jake had found her, had hired lawyers who convinced a judge that a new mother with postpartum depression wasn't fit to care for 2 infants, had used his connections and money to make Emily's life a legal nightmare. She was terrified he'd take the babies from her, Martha continued, her voice breaking. Terrified he'd hurt them to punish her for leaving, so she made a choice that nearly destroyed her. Emily had given up her daughters for adoption, believing it was the only way to keep them safe from their father. She'd moved to Montana, changed her last name, started over with nothing but the hope that anonymity might protect both her and the children she'd loved too much to keep. She never stopped looking for them, Martha said. Never stopped trying to find a way to get them back. She hired investigators, checked adoption databases, filed appeals with family court. But the system, once children disappear into it, they're hard to find, especially when the records are sealed for their protection. When she met you, Martha continued, Emily was different, lighter, like she'd finally found someone who could love her enough to help heal what was broken, but she was also terrified of losing you. By telling me the truth, by revealing that she wasn't the perfect woman you thought she was, Emily always felt like she had to earn love, Martha explained, her voice heavy with years of watching her daughter struggle with shame that wasn't hers to carry. Had to be flawless to deserve it. The idea of telling you she'd given up her own children. She was convinced you'd see her as broken, damaged, someone who couldn't be trusted with the family you wanted to build together. Lucas thought about all the times Emily had apologized for things that didn't need apologies. All the times she'd seemed surprised when he chose her, again and again in small daily ways. All the times she'd whispered, "Are you sure you love me?" in the darkness of their bedroom, as if his love were something fragile that might evaporate if she breathed on it wrong. "She was going to tell you," Martha said, leaning forward with the urgency of someone who'd waited 3 years to deliver this message. Right before the accident, she'd finally located the girls. They were in a group home in Missoula, had been there for 2 years. She'd started the paperwork to get them back, had hired a lawyer who specialized in reuniting families. "She came to see me the week before she died," Martha continued. She was transformed, like someone who'd been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. "She said she was ready to trust that your love was big enough for the truth, that she was going to bring her daughters home and give you the family you'd both been dreaming about." Emily had been planning to tell him everything on Valentine's Day, had been planning to surprise him with the news that they weren't just going to be parents, they already were. That somewhere in Montana, 2 little girls were waiting to meet the man their mother loved enough to finally trust with their existence. But the accident had happened first, and Emily's secrets had died with her, leaving Lila and Daisy lost in a system that had already failed them too many times. Until a snowstorm and a broken man's decision to turn around had given love a second chance. Lucas drove home through a landscape that looked exactly the same but felt completely different. Every assumption he'd built his grief on had crumbled in the space of 2 hours. Emily wasn't the perfect woman he'd idealized in memory. She was something more complex, more human, more heartbreaking. She was a mother who'd given up everything to protect her children, including the right to be their mother. And now those children were sleeping in his guest bedroom, calling him by his first name, unaware that they were living in the house their mother had shared with the man she'd loved, enough to trust with the truth she'd never had the chance to tell. Lucas sat in his car in his own driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the warm light spilling from his windows. Inside, Lila was probably helping Daisy with a puzzle, or reading her a story from one of Emily's books, or singing one of those wordless songs that somehow conveyed more emotion than any lyrics could. Inside were Emily's daughters, the children she'd loved so much she'd given them up to keep them safe, the children she'd spent 5 years searching for, 5 years trying to reclaim, the children she'd died trying to bring home. And Lucas wasn't their father, had no biological connection to them, no legal obligation beyond the temporary emergency custody arrangement, no reason to disrupt his carefully reconstructed life for 2 little girls who belonged to Emily's past, not his future. He could call social services in the morning, explain that he'd discovered their identities and needed to transfer their care to the appropriate authorities. It would be clean, simple, responsible. The girls would be placed with a family better equipped to handle the complexities of raising traumatized children. A family with experience, with training, with the kind of maternal instincts Lucas had never developed. He could go back to his quiet house and his ordered grief, and his life that made sense in its emptiness. So why did the thought of it make him feel like he was drowning in his own driveway? "Lucas," Daisy threw herself at his legs the moment he walked through the door, her face bright with the uninhibited joy that only 6-year-olds possess. "We made dinner." "Well, Lila made dinner, and I helped by not touching anything hot." She thrust a construction paper drawing toward him, a family of stick figures holding hands under a rainbow that took up half the page. Lucas took it with hands that trembled slightly, studying the careful detail Daisy had put into each figure. The tall man with dark hair and kind eyes, the 2 little girls with auburn hair and big smiles, and in the corner, barely visible unless you looked carefully, a 4th figure with wings and a halo watching over the others with a gentle smile. "It's beautiful, Daisy," Tell me about the people in your picture. That's you, she said, pointing to the tall figure. And that's me and Lila. And that's our mama in heaven making sure we're safe. The casual mention of their mother hit Lucas like a physical blow. These children had memories of Emily that he'd never heard. Stories he'd never been told. A version of the woman he'd loved that had existed before him, beyond him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tell me about your mama, he found himself saying, settling onto the couch between them. Lila looked up from her homework. Math problems that Emily would have helped her with in another life, in a world where secrets didn't have to be kept. She had pretty hair like mine, and she always smelled like flowers, and she sang to us when we had bad dreams. What did she sing? I don't remember the words, Lila admitted, but I remember how it felt. Like being wrapped up in sunshine. Like nothing bad could happen as long as she was singing. That evening, for the first time since they'd arrived, the girls began to share fragments of their life before. Not the traumatic parts, those would come later if they came at all, but small, precious memories that painted a picture of Emily as a mother Lucas had never had the chance to see. Mama used to read us stories every night, Daisy said, curled, up next to Lucas with a picture book. She did all the voices. She was really good at dragon voices. She made the best pancakes, Lila added from her spot on the other side of the couch. She would make them shaped like animals, and we had to guess what they were before we could eat them. She painted our room yellow, Daisy continued. She said yellow was the color of happiness, and she wanted us to wake up happy every day. Each memory was a revelation, a glimpse into the life Emily had built with her daughters before everything fell apart. Lucas found himself hungry for these stories, desperate to understand the woman he'd loved through the eyes of the children, who'd known her first. But the stories also brought questions that cut like broken glass. How had Emily hidden her grief when the girls were taken away? How had she smiled and laughed and built a life with him while carrying the weight of such devastating loss? How had she been present for their relationship while part of her heart was always searching for her missing children? That night, Daisy spiked a fever, 103.2 degrees. Lucas found her thrashing in her bed at 2 a.m, delirious and calling out words that weren't quite coherent but were heavy with desperate longing. Mama, don't leave me. I'll be good, I promise. Don't leave me again. I didn't mean to be bad. Lucas spent the night holding cold washcloths to her forehead, monitoring her temperature, calling the pediatric nurse hotline every hour. He gave her children's Tylenol and sang half-remembered lullabies and whispered reassurances that felt inadequate against the fever dreams that were tormenting her. Lila curled up in the chair beside her sister's bed, refusing to leave despite Lucas's gentle insistence that she needed sleep. I can't, Lila whispered when he suggested she go back to her own bed. What if she needs me and I'm not here? What if she wakes up and thinks everyone left again? At 4 a.m, Daisy's fever broke. She opened her eyes, looked directly at Lucas with the kind of clarity that comes after crisis, and whispered, Daddy? The word hung in the air between them like a bridge Lucas was afraid to cross. His breath caught in his throat. I'm not your daddy, sweetheart, he said gently, brushing damp hair back from her forehead. I'm Lucas. Remember? Daisy studied his face with the serious concentration children reserve for very important decisions. Her eyes were clear now, fever bright but focused. Then she reached up and patted his cheek with her small warm hand. But you're taking care of me like a daddy would. And that's when Lucas finally understood what Emily had been trying to tell him all those years ago. If one day I'm no longer here, will you still love me like before? She hadn't been asking if he'd love her memory. She hadn't been asking if he'd grieve appropriately or honor their relationship or keep her picture on his nightstand. She'd been asking if he'd love her completely, flaws and secrets and impossible choices included. She'd been asking if his love was big enough to include the parts of her story that she was too afraid to tell. Sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness, holding a child who wasn't his but felt like she belonged in his arms anyway, Lucas finally had his answer. Love isn't about perfection. It's not about knowing every detail of someone's past or having every question answered. Love is about choosing again and again to see the whole person, shadows and light together, and deciding that what you see is worth fighting for. Emily had been a mother before she'd been his wife. She'd made impossible choices with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd do anything to keep her children safe. She'd carried the weight of those choices alone because she'd learned to believe that love was conditional on being worthy of it. But Lucas finally understood. She had been worthy, exactly as she was, with all her secrets and scars and desperate decisions. The woman who'd given up her children to protect them was the same woman who'd loved him with the kind of totality that transformed everything it touched. And these children, these beautiful, complicated, heartbreaking children, were the most precious gift Emily could have left behind. Not just because they were part of her, but because they were her chance to love the way she'd always deserved to be loved. Completely, unconditionally, with no requirement to earn what they'd already been freely given. When morning came, Lucas didn't call social services. Instead, he called his lawyer. And then he called the school district. And then he went shopping for twin beds with princess sheets and nightlights that projected stars on the ceiling. Because family isn't defined by biology or legal documents or perfect circumstances. Family is defined by showing up on the hardest night and choosing to stay. Family is defined by loving someone not because you have to, but because you can't imagine a world where you don't. 6 months later, when the adoption papers were finalized, and Lila and Daisy officially became Lila and Daisy Granger, Lucas would look back on that fevered night as the moment when his real life began. Not the life he'd planned or the life he'd thought he wanted, but the life that had been waiting for him all along, just around the corner of his greatest heartbreak. Sometimes, love doesn't end when someone dies. Sometimes it just finds new ways to express itself. Sometimes it shows up wearing the faces of two little girls who needed a father just as much as he needed a reason to be one. Take a moment right now to think about the children in your life, whether they're your biological children, stepchildren, nieces, nephews, or kids you've encountered who needed someone to show up for them. Sometimes the most important parenting happens when we choose love over obligation, when we decide that family is built with intention rather than accident. 12 months can change everything. Lucas learned this as he watched Lila carefully paint the final details on her latest artwork, a watercolor of 3 figures standing in snow, their hands linked, their faces turned toward a sun that was just beginning to break through storm clouds. The transformation in both girls had been remarkable. Lila had blossomed from a cautious, hypervigilant child into a confident 7-year-old who asked questions about everything and read books that were meant for children twice her age. She'd started therapy with Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist, who specialized in helping kids process trauma, and slowly, carefully, she'd begun to trust that this home was permanent. Daisy had changed too, but in different ways. Her scar had faded to a thin silver line, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. More importantly, the wordless songs she used to sing had evolved into actual melodies, lullabies their mother had taught them, fragments of Disney songs, and new compositions of her own that spoke of safety and belonging. "What do you think?" Lila asked, stepping back to examine her work with the critical eye of a young artist who took her craft seriously. The painting was remarkable, not just for its technical skill, though Lila had always been gifted with colors and brushes, but for its emotional honesty. The man in the center was clearly Lucas, tall and protective, his arms wrapped around both girls. The 2 girls on either side were unmistakably Lila and Daisy, but they looked different than they had a year ago. Stronger, happier, more rooted. But it was the background that took Lucas's breath away. Faintly, painted in soft watercolor washes that you might miss if you weren't looking carefully, was the figure of a woman with auburn hair. Not solid, not fully present, but there, watching over them with a smile that held both sadness and peace, love and letting go. "I think," Lucas said, his voice slightly rough with emotion, "it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The Emily Legacy Foundation occupied 3 floors of a downtown Billings building that had once housed a regional bank. Now it was filled with social workers, family advocates, and children who needed someone to see them as more than their circumstances. The walls were covered with artwork created by kids in the program, paintings and drawings that told stories of loss and hope, fear and healing, families broken and families rebuilt. Lucas had started the foundation 6 months after the adoption. Papers were finalized, using a significant portion of his personal wealth to create something that would honor Emily's memory, while addressing the systemic failures that had separated her from her daughters. What began as a way to process his own complicated grief had evolved into something larger, a network of support for children who'd fallen through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. We've placed 47 children in permanent homes this year, his director of operations, Maria Santos, reported during their weekly meeting. And we're piloting a new program to support families who want to adopt older children or sibling groups. The wait times are down by 60% compared to state averages. Lucas nodded, making notes in his leather portfolio, but part of his attention was on the framed photo on his desk. Not the old wedding picture that had once dominated his office, that now hung in the living room at home, next to Lila's painting, but a new one. Lila and Daisy on their first day of school, backpacks, almost as big as they were, grinning at the camera with the confidence of children who know they're loved unconditionally. "Tell me about the therapeutic support program," Lucas said, turning his attention back to Maria. "Dr. Chen is leading that initiative. We're providing trauma-informed therapy for children in transition, and we're training foster families in attachment-focused parenting. The preliminary results are extraordinary. Placement disruptions are down by 40%. Every weekday at 3:15, Lucas would park outside Riverside Elementary and wait for his daughters to emerge from their respective classrooms. Lila would appear first, walking with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to be responsible for others. She'd scan the parking lot until she spotted his car, then break into the kind of smile that reminded him so much of Emily. It was like seeing sunshine after a long winter. Daisy would follow moments later, usually covered in paint or glue, or evidence of whatever craft project had captured her attention that day. She'd run to the car with the uninhibited joy of a child who'd learned that the adults in her life would be there when promised. "How was school today?" Lucas would ask. The same question every parent asks, hoping for more than the standard fine that most children offered. But Lila and Daisy, perhaps because they'd learned not to take stability for granted, usually had stories to share. Lila would talk about the books she was reading, the math problems she'd solved, the project she was working on. Daisy would describe her art class creations, the songs they'd learned in music, the games they'd played at recess. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm reading at a 4th grade level," Lila announced one Thursday afternoon, pride evident in her voice. "That's amazing, sweetheart. What are you reading now?" "A book about a girl whose parents die and she has to live with her uncle. But it's not sad like it sounds. It's about how she makes the house happy again." Lucas caught her eyes in the rearview mirror, understanding the deeper meaning in her choice of stories. Lila was still processing her own journey from loss to belonging, still making sense of how families could be broken and rebuilt. That night, as they did every evening, Lucas tucked the girls into their beds. They'd moved from the guest bedroom to their own room 6 months ago. Lila had chosen soft greens and blues, while Daisy had opted for purple and silver with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. But the bedtime routine remained the same. Stories for Daisy, quiet conversations for Lila, and the reassurance of consistency that both girls craved. "Dad?" Lila said as Lucas was about to turn off her bedside lamp. She'd started calling him Dad 4 months ago, casually, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Each time, it still made his heart skip in a way that felt like gratitude and wonder combined. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "Do you ever miss how quiet the house used to be?" Lucas sat down on the edge of her bed, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Lila's questions were never casual. She thought deeply about everything, analyzing situations, with the kind of wisdom that came from having to grow up too fast. "You know what I miss?" he said finally. "What?" "I miss thinking that quiet meant peaceful. Now I know it just meant empty." Lila smiled. One of her rare, brilliant smiles that transformed her entire face and reminded him so much of Emily. It was like looking at a ghost, made of light and love. "I'm glad you found us in the snow," she said softly. "I'm glad you let me find you. I'm glad you trusted me enough to come home with me." It wasn't really trust at first, Lila admitted with the kind of honesty that still caught Lucas off guard. It was just, we didn't have anywhere else to go. But then, it became trust. And then it became love. Later, after the girls were asleep, Lucas walked through his house, their house, and marveled at how different it felt from the mausoleum it had been just a year ago. Art supplies scattered across the dining room table where he and Emily used to eat quiet dinners for two. Backpacks hanging by the front door where Emily's purse used to sit. The refrigerator covered in drawings and spelling tests and pictures from school plays, layered over shopping lists written in his careful handwriting. He paused in front of the living room mantel, where Lila's painting now hung in the place of honor. Next to it was Emily's wedding photo, but it looked different now. Not like a monument to the past, but like a bridge between what was and what had become. Emily's smile in the photograph seemed to echo the expression of the painted figure watching over their new family. Emily had asked him once if he would still love her if she wasn't there anymore. At the time, he'd thought she was talking about death, about whether he'd be able to move on after losing her. Now he understood she'd been talking about transformation, about whether his love was elastic enough to stretch around truths he didn't know, choices he might not understand, and a future that looked nothing like what they'd planned together. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It doesn't even end when we discover they weren't who we thought they were. Real love, the kind that changes you, the kind that makes you larger than you were before. That kind of love just finds new ways to express itself. Emily lived in Lila's fierce protectiveness of her sister, in the way she approached every problem, with careful logic and boundless creativity. She lived in Daisy's endless capacity for joy, in her ability to find magic in ordinary moments and beauty in broken things. She lived in the foundation that bore her name and the children who found homes because of her story. And she lived in Lucas's daily choice to be the father she'd always believed he could be, even when he hadn't believed it himself. Family isn't defined by last names or blood or biology. It's defined by commitment and love. It's defined by showing up on the hardest days and choosing to stay. It's defined by seeing someone, really seeing them, with all their imperfections and impossible choices, and deciding that they're worth. Fighting for Lucas Granger learned this on a snowy Montana night, when two little girls taught him that love isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask the right questions. It's about understanding that broken doesn't mean worthless, that secrets don't always equal betrayal, and that sometimes the family we're meant to have finds us in the most unexpected ways. Emily had loved him enough to trust him with her daughter's future. Even though she'd never had the chance to explain their past, she'd believed in his capacity for love even when trauma had taught her that love could be dangerous, conditional, something that could be lost if you weren't careful enough to earn it. And now, every morning when he made breakfast for 3 instead of 1 every evening when he helped with homework and listened to bedtime stories, every time Lila called him Dad, or Daisy fell asleep holding his hand, Lucas was proving that Emily's faith in him had been justified. Love multiplies when you give it away. Families are built with intention, not accident. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we discover that our greatest losses were preparing us for our most unexpected joys. If this story touched your heart, I want you to know something important. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You deserve a second chance, both in love and in life. Whatever secrets you're carrying, whatever choices you regret, whatever pain you're holding, none of it disqualifies you from love. The woman listening to this right now, the one who feels like she's failed at marriage, at motherhood, at love itself, you are not broken beyond repair. You are not too damaged to deserve happiness. Your story isn't over, and the chapters still to be written might be the most beautiful ones yet. Please like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that our broken places are often where the light gets in. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story that might be exactly what your heart needs to hear. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time when love showed up in your life, wearing a face you didn't recognize. Tell me about the moment you realize that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, commitment, and the courage to love imperfectly. And remember, as you lie in bed tonight processing this story, you are not alone in your journey. We're all just walking each other home, one story at a time, one moment of grace at a time. Until next time, choose love, choose hope, choose to show up for the people who need you, even when, especially when, you're not sure you're enough. You are enough. You have always been enough.